Hi everyone, this is a video edition of the Scattered podcast. I'm Yvonne Chorlin. I'm a physical or biological anthropologist and archaeologist, and this is a short video of my contribution to the Alberta portion of a cross-Canada scavenging project led by Dr. Sherry Forbes. To learn more about Sherry and the origin of this project, listen to episode 16 of the audio portion of this podcast. In a nutshell, law enforcement need to recover as much potential forensic evidence as possible to help solve cases. They approach Sherry with two questions. Where do we search for this evidence and how far do we search for it? To help answer these questions, Sherry wants to identify the scavengers and their scavenging behavior to figure out who may have influenced the movement of this evidence, and then also to map the dispersal of the evidence so we know where it went. By identifying the scavengers and their scavenging behavior and mapping the dispersal of the evidence, we hope to see patterns and be able to answer the two questions of where and how far to search for the remains so that we can answer this for law enforcement. So having these ideas and these questions is all fine and dandy, but how do you do this? How do you identify the scavengers and map the dispersal of the remains? Well, that's where this video comes in. I'm going to show you. This video is of our WaterValley site. We had two pigs at the WaterValley site, one in an open environment, one in a closed environment. We set out this pig in August 4th, 2021. We dressed it in human clothing and then positioned it in a clear spot where cameras could have a clear view of what was going on with the pig. We tied the pig with a cable to a tree to try to keep the pig within the camera frames. The cable really only slowed the scavengers down, it didn't impede them. Then we set the cameras to make sure that they had a clear view of the pig to monitor and capture any scavenger activity that happened on the pig. Then we cleared the site so that any vegetation would not trigger the motion sensors on the cameras. And then I mapped the site to show where the pig was in relation to any topographical features, including fence lines, buildings, and roads. Then we set the cameras and left the site to see what happened. First on the scene were deer. Then a bear showed up. Then birds, mostly magpies. Then eventually, magpies gave way to a coyote. We had a skunk show up and stay for a bit. More deer, a fox, and then the coyotes came back, and the coyotes brought company. The coyotes investigated, scavenged, and then eventually they moved the carcass. Here you can see the coyote moving the carcass from west to east over the log. Before first snowfall and after scavenging had slowed, we returned to the site to do a preliminary search. We went back to the WaterValley site on October 22nd, 2021, approximately 3 months after we initially placed the pig. At the original deposition point, we still saw body staining, and a lot of the bones look like this. They were very well camouflaged in the leaf litter. We saw hair and skin, and we saw clothing too. The dress that we saw draped over a log was still there. We saw that the remains were on a clear trail through the bush and led out into cropland. These trails were created during their dispersal. They were clear in the vegetation, but they were definitely not there when we had placed the carcass. They were created during the dispersal. I drew a sketch map that was in addition to the original one that I had done before, indicating the dispersal and game trails so we could see any patterns. Then we left again to return in the spring to do a final search and collection of the remains. All right, we are at the WaterValley Open site. It is August 5th, 2022, and we've come out to discover that there is lush vegetation all over the place. Grass growth is crazy. Grass growth is probably anywhere from 2 to 3 to 4 feet tall. So you can see some of our flags here now that we've kind of trampled down the grass, but then we're trying to find the bone fragments that we recorded, and we had to dig through the grass. So there's a shot of the grass, And that's our original deposition point. And we had to dig down to find that there's still body staining, still bone fragments, whole bone, but it was a difficult find. So here is the tree with the cable that we had. Here is our original deposition point. Now that we've trampled the grass and cleared the site of the bones, any remains that are still remaining. And then the carcass was moved here. That tree was where the shirt was first hung up. And then beyond that was a game trail where the remains were dispersed. So from the original deposition point here, the remains were scattered through here and then along the game trail towards the open field there. The shirt was dragged from the original deposition point. It was hung up on this tree, and then it was dragged somehow over back in here to a low area right back in there. And there was also a femur back in there. We also had some remains just behind this tree back in there. So it's a bit difficult to see. The game trail had disappeared, and if it wasn't for the flags, not too sure we would have found any of the remains from last year. So it's a good thing that we had flagged it, and everything is now in boxes, and I'll have to count it up and see what's left over. When I did an inventory on the remains that we recovered about a year after we deposited the pig at the WaterValley Open site, we found that we had recovered about 50% of the skeleton. This is a lot less than we had predicted and we had hoped, but it's good to know. When I looked at what remains were within the 50% that we found, about 40% were ribs and vertebrae. I was also curious to see if the amount of remains that we saw at the preliminary search and at the final collection differed. And it did. Between the preliminary search and the final search, there was a difference. At most sites, the number of remains went down, but at the WaterValley site, they went up. Why is that? It's very likely that the number only appears to go up. Remember I said that we had to dig to find the remains. It's very likely that at the preliminary search we didn't find everything, and that at the final search when we were digging around we found more that was hidden, and that would account for the higher number at the final search. So what have we learned so far? Well, at this site we know that the main scavengers were coyotes and birds. The birds are mostly magpies. Scavenging activity started possibly with a bear, then the magpies definitely scavenged. The coyotes appeared at the end of August and came back and then continued to scavenge. Little activity occurred after the initial scavenging activity and the movement done by the coyotes. Remains were dispersed along game trails and were created during the dispersal event. We recovered about 50% of this pig skeleton, and most remains that we recovered were vertebrae and ribs. So what have we learned overall across all of our sites? We learned that our main scavengers are coyotes, bears, and birds, as we saw here. Game trails can be created or used by scavengers to access the carcass and disperse the remains. Between the preliminary search and the final search, there was a difference. Initially, we discovered 20 to 50% of the remains within about 3 months of the carcass placement, and then that went down at about a year when we discovered only 2 to 53%. The majority of the remains were discovered within a 100-meter radius of the original deposition point, and the majority of the bones that we recovered were either vertebrae or ribs. This video would not have been possible without the study led by Dr. Sherry Forbes. The Calgary and Edmonton Police Services were instrumental in helping us find land to use and to coordinate the searches and carcasses, and of course, to let us know if this information is useful to them. Many big, huge, massive thanks to the landowners and pig growers. We couldn't have done this research without you. To find out more about this study and the topic of scattered and scavenged remains, tune into my podcast. Scattered, one person's search for the story behind scattered remains, available on your favorite podcast platform. Also, check out other videos in this series about this study, available on my website, yvonnechorlin.com, and read about it on my blog and Facebook, The Reluctant Archaeologist.